All right. All right, let's get Craig bot in here. Gordon.
Now recording.
How's everyone doing today? We are, where were we? Page 33? 34? I know you're trying to say something. Page 30, right? I can't, you're still not coming through. Page 30, we haven't quite started Letters on Evil yet, right?
We had not, no, we were about to.
Yeah, page 30.
Don't know what's going on, Derek. Do you want to try reconnecting real quick? Maybe. Well, we'll give Derek a second to reconnect. Good chance of talking. I mean, no one wants that. Jack will not be joining us today for a bit, maybe at all. Sadly, he has found a job that is, you know how academia works. Not a job, a life. So we wish him all the best. I guess with Derek gone, before we start off, evil. Is there anything people wanted to go over today before we move on? Anything? Couple sections? Anything people had trouble sort of grappling with? Anything at all?
Yeah, the last section he ended with this phrase, "conquest of the unconscious."
Yes.
I was wondering what he means by that.
Oh, that's fine. Higher ethics is a voyage in immanence, but immanence is the unconscious itself, conquest of the unconscious. So the voyage in immanence, and I think this is in a lot of Deleuze. We just finished What is Philosophy? It's certainly in there. The idea of the closer we get to the immanent, the immediate now, the totality of things, the chaos, the more we get closer to that, sort of really this is the point of philosophy, is the point of things, is to sort of make use of or drive us closer to the immanent. When we're talking about the conquest of the immanence, conquest of the unconscious, it is that voyage itself, the conquest of the unconscious, understanding the unconscious, conquering it in the way of bringing it in line. It's one of Spinoza's sort of underlying larger themes, that people who are, like the section we just finished talking about, the whole section, people who are sort of slaves to their sad passions, who are unaware of all the things that drive them, of their unconscious. The goal for Spinoza is to conquer this, to be able to understand it through, he describes it through rationality. Deleuze takes a little bit further than that, which we'll get through here, but it's the conquest of that to drive things. Does that make sense? What's the...
Yeah, thanks. That does make sense.
Cool. All right, Derek, let's hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hey, look at that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I might say it might still be a bit glitchy. I don't know.
It is a bit glitchy, but you know, it's sound and clear at least, so I'll take it.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, sorry, go ahead,
yeah,
Derek.
I was just going to say, I think I kind of missed. Sorry, I'm just waiting for my thing to connect. I missed what you were saying, but you're probably saying what I'm going to say. So the three things that were in the previous chapter about the three terms of what It's called devaluation. So devaluation of consciousness, devaluation of values, particularly good and evil, and a devaluation of the self. And I think at the end of that chapter, Deleuze talks about the three practical problems of the ethic. And in a way, I think this chapter will touch on at least one of them.
Yes.
And even more, but the three practical problems is: how does one arrive at a maximum of joyful passions? That's how does one how does one Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. How does one arrive?
I can do this because so just to mention, we were going over with J.K. asked what he meant by conquest of unconscious, which is, to your point, this is about the three sort of elements that he went through. The reasons for him being accused of materialism, immoralism, and atheism is because what Spinoza in Ethics is doing is the first thing he does is he devalues consciousness in favor of thought. This is the materialism that Spinoza has that he was very much condemned. The second element is he devalues value, like a devaluation of values itself, like good and evil. The elimination of these, what I would say, transcendent categories, in favor of good or bad, about how bodies come together, like directly, a lot less transcendental, a lot less transcendent, like good and evil. The third is this devaluation of sad passions in favor of joy. This is sad passions tend to be, and it's how Spinoza talks about it and how Deleuze comes off of it. Sad passions are considered like the honorable, or the things a good person feels. The way that my favorite example from Spinoza is if you see a poor unhoused man on the street and you feel pity. This is, oh, I'm such a good person for feeling pity. Or this is a sad passion, though, because pity isn't just like, oh, I'm a good person. Pity comes because of your own impotence at being able to fix the thing. If fixing the situation was something you could do, if it was in your power to fix that, you wouldn't feel pity, you'd just fix it. But the inability to fix it is the sad passion, this thing. So this is where Spinoza really pushes against the idea of sort of traditionally religious ethics, religious sort of teachings in that sense. And so the conquest of the consciousness that he undergoes is, again, the understanding of these, the grasping of these, and the moving forward. Consciousness is opposed to thought, wouldn't both be considered non-material for it. So it's a question of how you consider them coming to be. The thing for Spinoza is not that he wants like us to fully just grasp consciousness and be totally cool with consciousness. He wants us to conquer the unconscious, the thing that produces consciousness, is in how he sees things. So it would be like saying, to just borrow from anti-Oedipus, when you have factories that are producing a certain good, and all you care about is that certain good, or you say that those factories are toy makers, smile and you're done. You forget about the men inside. You forget about the materials going inside. You forget everything else. No, these things are still produced. It's not like toys aren't coming out. Like toys are still coming out. iPhones are still coming out. Water bottles are still coming out of the factory. But you've misunderstood what creates them. And you're at the whim of that creation itself rather than the processes, understanding the processes that create those toys. So then when I don't like that toy, that's not the point. You can't change the toy, you got to change the production. And this is the difference. So it's the materiality of the unconscious, of the drives for this, the doing away with the, again, good and evil as transcendent categories, instead good and bad for bodies and how they connect, gives a materiality to the unconscious, which produces the conscious. That makes sense.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, because I think you're right. It's not thought; it's the unconscious. So consciousness is devalued in favor of the unconscious, and I think the idea of the material, I don't think really applies to Spinoza. I think it's the kind of fundamental idea of substance, but that will be seen to have a particular kind of definition as we go through the book. And just to go through the what does he call it? The where are we? Threefold practical problems of the ethics, some of which are going to be touched on in this chapter. So the first one, as we already said, how does one arrive at a maximum of joyful passions? Second one, how does one manage to form adequate ideas? And the last one, how does one become conscious of oneself, of God, and of things? And so at least one part, I think two of these are kind of touched upon in the chapter we're going to read today.
It is. All right. Yeah, I feel as though, regardless, though, Spinoza and Deleuze materialism is not the same materialism we talk about usually. I say that because of affect or phrased differently, Bergsonian virtual. I think there's edges to it that are different, but I would be very hard pressed to say it's a different materialism than Marx. Like, it's the same materialism underneath. It's the same at its core. There's some functions that are different, some processes that work, but it's the same materialism in that sense. But that is a discussion for AO. Join us next week. Go through. Because for this, we're going right to the letters on evil, corresponding with Blinberg. I finally got my copy of Spinoza's Correspondence. I've been looking for a really good English copy for a while. My favorite part in it, there's letters between him and Leibniz. I just have to mention this because this just made me crack the fuck up. And my first reaction when I hear that Spinoza and Leibniz corresponded, that Leibniz sent a paper of his to Spinoza. We have the back and forth. We have the paper. I'm like, holy shit. I can't wait to read this. And it's about the optics for glasses. So it's the most boring fucking thing I've ever read in my life. So like it's just, I just love that like just this useless conversation. I just like that. All right, we'll get to reading. This is from Spinoza's Correspondences. The correspondence with Blinberg forms a set of 8 extant. Oh, I need to share my screen. All right. All right. The correspondence with Blinberg forms a set of 8 extant letters. At 18 to 24 and 26, I guess. Or for each correspondent, I don't know. Or for each correspondent, written between December 1664 and June 1665. They are extremely interesting from a psychological view. Blinberg is a grain broker who writes to question Spinoza concerning the problem of evil. Spinoza believes at first that his correspondent is motivated by a search for truth, but he soon realizes that Blinberg has a taste for argument, a desire to be right, a mania for judging, an amateur Calvinist theologian instead of a philosopher. Spinoza replies curtly to certain of Blinberg's impertinence as early as his second letter, and yet he continues the correspondence as if he were himself fascinated by the subject. Spinoza will not break off until after a visit by Blinberg, and when the latter begins to raise questions of every sort, going beyond the problem of evil. Now this is precisely where the profound interest of this group of letters resides. They are the only long texts in which Spinoza considers the problem of evil per se, risking analyses of statements that have no equivalent in his other writings. We're not analyzing that paragraph. We're not stopping. Sorry, Derek, you don't get to go sentence by sentence. I don't think you want to either.
Well, I just think one thing to say is that he makes a clear distinction between a philosopher and a Calvinist. So the Calvinist has a mania, takes for argument and a desire to be right, a mania for judging an amateur Calvinist theologian instead of a philosopher. So the Calvinists were one of his opponents, the people who kind of who harassed him. So in that you get a kind of little snapshot of what is a Calvinist, and why it's opposed to what Spinoza is, which is a philosopher.
And if anyone wants, I can. As we finish up the Blanenberg stuff, it is worth reading a couple of passages from it. Here, in case you want to do. As for Blanenberg, he does not at all appear to be stupid or confused, as he is often said to be. Faults are elsewhere. Although he does not know the ethics, he begins his first letter with remarks on Spinoza's exposition of Descartes' philosophy. He raises one basic question for another, questions that go to the heart of Spinozism. He forces Spinoza to give example on example, to develop paradoxes, to isolate a very strange conception of evil. It is as if the love of truth led Spinoza to shed his characteristic caution, to drop his mask even in front of an individual who he senses as hostile or hateful, and concerning a delicate subject. The great rationalist theory, according to which evil is nothing, is doubtless a commonplace of the 17th century, but the way in which Spinoza will radically transform it is the essential business of the correspondence with Blanenberg. If evil is nothing, in Spinoza's view, this is not because only good has being and produces being, but, on the contrary, because good has no more being than does evil, because being is beyond evil. I say, see what you did there? I see what you did there, Deleuze.
So the question is the question of evil, and so Deleuze talks about the what he calls the great rationalist theory, according to which evil is nothing. And again, that's sort of puzzling, but he does explain it. He says so. The rationalists believe that evil is nothing, and he says it's a commonplace of the 17th century, but Spinoza transforms it, he radically transforms it, and that is what the kind of at the center of the letters correspondence between him and Blanenberg. And he gives a little idea of what the rationalists mean by evil is nothing. So he says, if evil is nothing, Spinoza, this is not because only good has being and produces being. So therefore, from that you can take that the rationalist view is that evil is nothing, i.e. has no being, whereas good has being. But so Spinoza's view is contrary to this. On the contrary, because good has no more being than does evil, and because being is beyond good and evil. So that gives us a kind of a place, which will become, obviously it's not explanatory. It doesn't explain what's meant by that. So we could endlessly speculate, but it just lays this kind of problem of evil, and we're going to expect that Spinoza will radically transform it, as Deleuze says, and what follows, we'll see how that transformation takes place.
Yeah, it's again, this era that Deleuze is framing here is the sort of enlightenment, whatever you call it, throughout everything. So the idea of evil, sin, and things like that were being regarded very differently than they had been prior. He hits at it here that the rationalist theory, according to which evil is nothing, the idea that there is no devil, that evil doesn't exist in that way, but good does. Good very much does. Virtue and justice, these types of things. This is kind of what Spinoza is sort of talking about, and that's kind of what he sort of speaks about, and Deleuze is hitting at here. So it's a
Yeah,
lot.
I think there's somewhere. I think he says somewhere that evil is non-being, and good is being. And Spinoza just wants to get rid of that kind of obvious that dichotomy and just say, well, they have no more being, neither of any more being than the other. And then he says said being. So this concept of being, what something is beyond both good and evil. So it's not dependent on these kind of values. Remember, we talked about the evaluation of values. It's not. It's beyond these values, the values of good and evil.
Beyond them. If there was another book written about values being beyond good and evil. But we'll keep going with Blaenberg, because we're still, I think, only in the second letter between them, making our way through. Blaenberg begins with a general question that he addresses to Cartesians. How can God be the cause of evil wills, such as Adam's will to eat of the forbidden fruit? Now, Spinoza answers immediately on his own behalf. It is only later in letter 11 that he will return to Descartes, pointing out certain differences between Descartes and himself. He is not satisfied with explaining the general sense in which evil is nothing. Taking up Blaenberg's example, he replies, the prohibition to Adam consisted only in this. God revealed to Adam that eating of that tree caused death, just as he also reveals to us through the natural intellect that poison is deadly to us. End quote. In other words, God does not prohibit anything, but he informs Adam that the fruit, by virtue of its composition, will decompose Adam's body. The fruit will act like arsenic. At the outset, then, we find Spinoza's basic thesis. What is bad should be conceived of as an intoxication, poisoning, and indigestion, or even taking account of individual factors as an intolerance or an allergy. And Blaenberg understands this very well. Quote, you omit the things I call vice, because they are contrary to your singular nature, not because they contain vice in themselves. You omit doing them, as we omit eating food that our nature finds disgusting. But what of a nature that does not have this intolerance, that loves crime? How can a personal disgust constitute a virtue? Blaenberg adds another very interesting question to which Spinoza does not reply directly. Is it only through experience that one can know that a thing is poisonous? Is evil only an experiential matter, a posteriori, and in that case, what is the meaning of revelation or knowledge? This is, as Derek and I were kind of just going over, the discussion of evil, discussion of, as I think we went through in the previous chapter, actually, the idea that evil is not about prohibition in law, but instead that evil is about the interaction of bodies to bodies, the way one will decompose another. And Spinoza hits on it quite a lot. He hits on it here again. This is also in ethics. It's also in a Theologus Politicus, where he is outlining how he sees the story of Adam and Eve, where Adam isn't actually told, don't eat of the apple from this tree. It's not really in the original writings. As Spinoza has it, and you see it a lot, it's much more, those who eat of this tree will die. That phrasing is different than just hey, this is no, don't do this, bad. But instead that the reality is that the fruit, by virtue of decomposing, this is what makes it bad. The fruit is like a poison to him. So that the idea is that we should conceive of the bad not as evil or as part of some sort of larger tapestry of evil, but instead this intoxication, poisoning, indigestion, or even intolerance or allergy. It doesn't have to be something that literally kills you. It can be just something that's bad for you. I'm lactose intolerant. Milk is bad for me. It can be something like that. Like, bad is bad, really kind of on that setup. And so this idea of how, the bodies that are decomposed by things, or bodies that decompose other bodies, are bad for you. But then the question is, as Blaenberg talks about it, if that's the case, then what if your body isn't decomposed by something that is clearly bad? For example, someone who robs banks. If it's in their nature robbing a bank isn't a bad thing. Like, what is it going to do to them? It's not bad. It doesn't decompose their body. So how does this work? Is it only through the sort of experience of life that we develop these things? Or is there a use for knowledge? Can we teach someone what is bad? And that's the question that Blainberg really throws at him in letter 10.
Yeah, I think at the beginning of this paragraph, so evil is the evil will. So basically, God forbids that we should eat, forbids the eating of the fruit. But Adam's will has what Bleinberg calls an evil will, which is to go against that prohibition, eat the fruit, and therefore he can be counted as evil in that sense. And we have to remember that the kind of one of the thing that Spinoza opposes, the ethics is an opposition to morality. So command that you must obey, whether you understand it or not, you must just obey it. Where the ethics is a kind of are things about how you should live your life, basically. That you and it's in a sense, but what the rules that you make. I suppose, although that's just going too far at the moment. But anyway, so Bleinberg is obviously interested in evil, and Adam's will to eat that is seen as evil because he's going against this prohibition that God has kind of issued. But Spinoza doesn't want to focus on that. He wants to focus on the effect of eating this apple. And as you said, it's a kind of he said the prohibition to Adam consisted only in this. This is all that was being said. God revealed to Adam that eating of that tree caused death, just as he also reveals to us through the natural poison is deadly to us. So we have a natural, if we are faced with poison, we know it's going to poison us. And it's a kind of a natural instinct. It's what we know about the world around us. And God was saying, don't eat that because it's equally poisonous, so it's not good for your body. And this is that idea of composition, decomposition. So it won't agree with your body. It will decompose the body. And this is the effect of poison. And so he said at the outset, then we find Spinoza's basic thesis is what is as intoxication, a poisoning, and indigestion. So these are all ways in which the body experiences something that we take in that doesn't agree with us. So drink, intoxication, poisoning, literally poison, or indigestion. And then there are other forms in which the body kind of reacts towards things, and he gives the example of intolerance or allergy. And so Blauenberg obviously understands this, but the question then is, understands it very well. You admit the things I call vice because they are contrary to your singular nature. So the singular, again, we have to remember that what he calls the individual is a singular essence. So singular. So this is individual to each person is an individual. We're not at this stage. Spinoza doesn't think of it as being kind of we're all governed by a universal. We're all different in that sense. And so you admit doing them as we admit eating food that our nature finds disgusting. But the question is, what of a nature does not have this intolerance and that loves crime? How can a personal disgust constitute a virtue? So again, it's this thing about, well, how is it that a personal disgust can be a virtue? Because obviously the thinking is the place that he's coming from is this kind of more moral view in which God commands and we have to obey, whereas Spinoza is talking about the personal, the individual. And then he asks another question.
Well, just real quick, because that specific, that personal disgust being a virtue, bank robbery or someone doing something that's that the thing that's happening or the body that's interacting be bad for me, or that I find it tasteful, it wouldn't be. It's important to remember when Blainberg is writing Spinoza, they're writing back and forth, and they're not using things like bad and good. Blainberg is stuck in the evil and good, and so when he says things like, the Adam eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, this act of evil, he says things like that. So when we're talking about, someone robs a bank, someone who can eat poison, like someone who isn't allergic to, like, as an example, someone who's allergic to peanuts and isn't. Peanuts are bad, but they're not because this other dude loves peanuts. How can personal disgust be a virtue? This thing that's happening, the ability for a person to go, oh, that's bad. I don't want that. Is that a virtue? This is how he's phrasing it. And the other one that he mentions, I actually just want to read from the original because I think it's said a little bit more clearly. Because Deleuze adds a little bit here. Then we'll let you go, Derek. But I just want to read the little. But you will say, if people knew that it was poison, they would know it is evil. But I answer that no one knows poison or can know it unless he has seen and heard that someone has hurt himself by using it. And if we suppose that up to this day we have never heard or seen anyone who has been hurt by the use of this kind of thing, we should not only not know it, but we should fearlessly use it and become hurt. Such like truths are taught to us every day. The argument he's making is the nature of, Deleuze uses the term revelation or knowledge, or it's knowledge being passed to us. Isn't there some value there? Because it's not so much, whether or not God says, don't eat this apple or this apple will kill you. Either way, like, he's passing on knowledge. But if you don't experience, if you don't know this, you can't know that this is the case, then how can it be, like, how does this work? How does evil or the bad work in this case if all you ever know is that which you've experienced personally? Sorry, Dark, go on ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's just saying. So he says, is the second question that Bleidenberg asks, is evil therefore only an experiential matter, a posteriori? You know something evil after you've experienced it. And then, but if that's the case, if evil is only something that's you experience first, and then think, oh yeah, that's evil. And then it said, what's the meaning of revelation? So, for example, if God says, oh, the apple is poison, do we have to then eat the apple in order to confirm God's revelation that the apple is poison? So this is the heart of the question, I think, that's being asked by Bleidenberg at this point.
Yeah, and the idea that people who don't know, as Bleidenberg says, we experience daily that fools happily poison themselves eating things they had no idea would kill them. Like, is that okay? Like, this feels not good. Like, is kind of his point. Really interesting back and forth. But yes, any notes or questions on this? Because again, so far, most of this is Deleuze really just recounting and not really doing critique or analyzing. So I'm kind of wanting to get through it so we can get to that part. But feel free to disagree. Anything here to go over? Any questions, notes, anyone?
Can I throw something in, Brooks?
Please, Rick.
I hadn't read that material, but I've read a lot of Deleuze, and I've spent a lot of time with Spinoza over the years, but it's been a lot of years. But I think as far as this idea of poison or evil, you keep saying, like, this is evil. We hadn't really said why it's evil. And you're like, why is poison bad? The obvious why poison bad is because it'll kill you or make you really sick. That's the obvious reason, which is right. But I think to Spinoza, he says it somewhere in the Ethics, is one of the early books, that the essence of anything is to be more of what it is. Actually, not more, that's Nietzsche. But he says, like, the essence of anything is to fulfill what it is, kind of thing. That's not a direct quote, but that's what it is. So to him, the idea of poison, the reason it's evil is it diminishes the bodily organism from, quote, fulfilling itself, being everything it can be.
Yep.
If it diminishes the power of the body, then that's a bad thing. If it enhances the power of the body, that's a good thing.
Yes.
Those are things we're just talking about the body. And I think to, Spinoza, because it's called the Ethics. I mean, so it's all about morality. It's definitely not trashing morality. It's called the Ethics, for crying out loud. But I think, to him, ultimately, once he gets to it, maybe I'm getting ahead of the game, again, because I hadn't read the material. But, if what's poison, what's evil for the body is what diminishes it, then as far as us as thinking subjects, what's bad for, quote unquote thinking is what diminishes our ability to think clearly in a most appropriate way. And such things as like following commandments probably isn't the best way to like come to the quote unquote most truest understanding.
Spot on. And this is why this back and forth with Blanberg is interesting, because the point Blanberg, and he doesn't make it as well as Deleuze does here, or I'm about to, but if I point and I go, hey, don't eat that, it's poisonous. Spinoza is all about getting rid of the idea of like transcendent good and evil, laws, rules. Aren't I doing that? Like, aren't I making a rule not to eat that by saying it's bad if you have no experience of the thing? I'm creating the rule, or as I think Spinoza puts it, not really creating a negative rule. What I'm doing is I'm encouraging a positive action of not eating it, of eating other things. And so there's this interesting sort of thing that Blanberg is getting at, where he's like, hey, so how does your I don't like rules thing work when really we're talking about making a rule of not eating a thing? Even though it's not, rule, a mom tells her kid, don't eat that, it'll kill you. It's kind of a rule. So it's this really interesting thing, and this is where we're going into right here. So yeah, that's great. Anyone else? Any other notes? Oh, it's been great. I haven't heard your voice in a while, Rick. It's good to hear from you.
Yeah, but isn't they're using the example of Adam eating the apple. Doesn't the apple represent the kind of knowledge, right? So is that a kind of it's not evil, but it could be bad, in terms of its relationship with God, but this kind of idea of knowledge, it seems kind of ironic that he would use that example.
It's so we got to really put ourselves in the time and place. The way the story of Adam was told is he was a pure soul. We would probably laugh about the idea and call him a naive, foolish, whatever, blah blah blah. But the apple fundamentally damaged Adam forever, like Adam and Eve both, because it did give them this knowledge of good and evil, their own nakedness, blah blah blah. But this is bad. Wouldn't you, like, again, you got to think about the time. Wouldn't you want to live in the Garden of Eden forever? Like, it's bad for you. Don't eat this apple. Fuck, now I got to kick you out. So, yep, now you know good and evil. So Eden goes away. Like that, it's bad. It is an odd for our position for sure, but it is from theirs deeply important. Specifically important because you really can't do anything that critiques the church to the level of saying that Adam was stupid, for example. Like that, little bit of heresy here and there is okay, but not that kind of stuff. So it's a timing thing. And also how Spinoza writes about it, I think, is important. Because they go back and forth, even in the correspondence, and he's got to be careful. You can feel how he writes. He's got to be so fucking careful how he goes back and forth. Spinoza writes back, the prohibition to Adam then consisted solely in this, namely that God revealed to Adam that the eating of the fruit of the tree brought death, just as he reveals also to us through our natural understanding that poison is deadly. In the Garden of Eden, you were eternal. Eating it would give you not eternal life. It would bring your death. Not immediately. Does that make sense, JK?
Plus, what's even worse besides dying is now you have to make your own food.
I mean, yeah, shit. You have to cook and like.
I mean, that's something I've never got adjusted to in life.
I mean, and Eve has to give birth to children, which I got 2 kids. I'll pass on that shit. That's not a fun. Like being in a car accident for 9 months.
Yeah. So then I'll just say one more thing on that, and then I'll shut up on that topic. But because then this, like Jan said in the thing, knowledge of good and evil. Then the operative phrase, we generally we hone in on this idea of good and evil, but really to Spinoza, the operative phrase is knowledge of, and that's what we need to hone in on. How do we get proper knowledge of? So it's not a question of what is good and what is evil, but how do we get the proper knowledge of? Do we get it through commandment, or is there some other way to go about getting that state?
Well, and this next paragraph, which I think I'm going to start moving to, is it's it's getting at that. It's a question of what poisoning is. What does bad mean? Like, we're already leaning towards that, so let's move towards this next sizable goddamn paragraph. All right. At this level of exactness, where the problem has immediately been carried, one must ask in what a poisoning consists, according to Spinoza. Each body has parts, a very large number of parts, but these parts belong to it only in terms of a certain relation, motion, rest. It characterizes it. The situation is very complex, for composite bodies have parts at very different orders, which enter into relations that are themselves diverse. Diverse relations compound to form the characteristic or dominant relation of a given individual, at this or that level. Hence, there is an interlocking of relations for each body and from one body to another, and this constitutes the form. For example, as Spinoza shows in a letter to Oldenburg, chyle and lymph are two bodies, each determined by its own relation, which compose the blood, according to a third, dominant relation. The blood, in turn, is part of an animal or human body, determined by another characteristic or dominant relation. There are no two bodies whose relations are identical, for example, individuals with exactly the same blood. What happens then in the case of poisoning or in the case of allergies? Factors of each relation must be taken into account. In these cases, it appears that one of the constitutive relations of the body is destroyed, opposed. Death occurs when the body's characteristic or dominant relation is determined to be destroyed. Quote, I understand the body to die when its parts are so disposed that they acquire a different relation of motion and rest. Spinoza thus makes clear what is meant by a relation being destroyed, opposed. This occurs when the relation, which is itself an eternal truth, is no longer realized by actual parts. What has been done away with is not the relation, which is eternally true, but rather the parts between which it was established and which have now assumed another relation. For example, the poison has decomposed the blood, i.e., has determined the parts of the blood to come under different relations that characterize other bodies, is it no longer being blood. Here again, Bleinberg understands very well and will say in his last letter, 14, that the same conclusion must hold for the soul. Being itself composed of a very large number of parts, it should undergo the same disintegration, parts passing into other non-human souls. And it is accurate at the end there. It's a weird way of phrasing it as you read it, but Bleinberg very much he seems to dig this idea of the relation of parts sort of being constitutive of the whole. The idea Spinoza puts forward, and we'll just say Deleuze, we'll just say he agrees with it. But it's the idea that you have these bodies and their relations that determine, and that the shifting of these relations or the changing of these relations, and significantly or even minorly, that shifts the whole, is decomposing. It isn't so much, say it one way, if I poison you and the poison just makes all the blood leave your body, all the parts are still there. Relations a little bit different. And that thing that is that shift is what they're getting at with being bad, like what poisoning, what is decomposition. It's very particular what Spinoza wants to do. It's not that it kills a thing, which is to him not an interesting way to describe anything, but instead that it decomposes the relations or rearranges things or changes the relations between elements that then changes the whole. That change for the whole necessarily as such is the decomposition. And so this is what he means by relations being destroyed or decomposed.
Yeah, I think it's important though to realize that the relations don't change; they're not destroyed. Because he says the relation is itself an eternal truth. So I think the parts that constitute the relation are things that change, but the relation itself doesn't change. And I think that's the kind of idea that we need to kind of understand, I think.
It's a nuanced thing because it's it is the relation between things is the relation between things, but it's that the relations that those things now have is different. So it's a shift in the relation of the element.
Yeah, I think they have well, what he says, they have another relation.
Yes.
So I think the idea is not the relations. So I mean, this is a kind of a much broader kind of idea that's being formulated at this period. I mean, particularly by people like Leibniz, and it comes out of differential equation, the differentiation and things like that, the calculus, in which the terms and the relation stays, but the terms will change. But anyway, that's not obviously relevant. Well, it is relevant, but it's not spoken about here. But I think again, if we should perhaps go through this paragraph and just kind of get an understanding of it. So, I mean, what this does, it kind of that kind of notion of composition, decomposition is now looked at in much greater detail in this paragraph. So this question, what is poisoning? What does poisoning consist of? According to Spinoza, and he starts off by saying each body has parts. So this is an important idea. Each body is made up of parts, a very large number of parts. But these parts belong to it, i.e. to the body, only in terms of a certain relation. And the relation is one of motion and rest. And I think that's the kind of, earlier in the book, he talks about a characteristic relation of bodies. And this is it. This is the characteristic relation of motion and rest. I mean, he doesn't go into any detail of what he means by this, but that is the term. And so the body has this characteristic relation between its parts of motion and rest. And he says the situation is very complex from composite bodies. So composite bodies are made up of parts. They're composite. Have parts of very different orders. So they have parts which have, in themselves, are different, which enter into relations that are themselves diverse. So we have diversity of relations in a body, compound to form the characteristic dominant relations of a given individual. So this individual is made up of all these diverse parts which themselves enter into diverse relationships. And it says, hence there is an interlocking of relations for each body, and from one body to another. So each body has these kind of parts, these relations, these diverse relations, which are kind of locked together. But then there's a similar relation between bodies. From one body to another, and this constitutes the form. And he gives the example of, I think it's quite a well-known example, of chyle and lymph. I mean, again, this is 18th century kind of science, so obviously it's not.
It is.
Correct,
It is a little old school. Like you wait at
Yeah.
some point for them to go in. Then the humors.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's just a way of trying to talk about this notion of relation and how the bodies themselves are.
If you'd be up for it,
of
I have the letter to Oldenburg open and read 2 paragraphs, because Deleuze's version of it is a little bit of almost presumption that you've because Spinoza speaks crisply. You'd be up for that, Derek?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. I shall therefore try to show the reason which compels me to make this assertion. But I should like first to warn you that I do not attribute to nature beauty or ugliness, order or confusion. For things cannot, except with respect to our imagination, be called beautiful, ugly, ordered, or confused. By connection of parts, I mean nothing else than the laws of nature of one part adapt themselves to the laws of nature of another part in such a way to produce the least possible opposition. With regard to the whole and the parts, I consider things as parts of some whole, insofar as their natures are mutually adapted, so that they are in accord among themselves as possible. But insofar as things differ among them, each produces an idea in our mind which is distinct from the others, is therefore considered to be a whole, not a part. For instance, since the motions of the particles of the lymph, chyle, etc., are so mutually adapted in respect of magnitude and figure, they clearly agree amongst themselves, and all together constitute one fluid, to the extent that only chyle, etc., are considered to be parts of the blood. But insofar as we conceive the lymph particle differing, let us now, if you please, imagine a small worm that lives in blood. whose sight is keen enough to distinguish the particles of blood, lymph, etc., his reason to observe how each part, on collision with another, either rebounds or communicates a part of its own motion. That worm would live in this blood as we live in this part of the universe. He would not consider each particle of blood to be a whole. And he would consider each particle of blood to be a whole and not a part. And he could not know how all the parts are controlled by the universal nature of blood and are forced, as the universal nature of blood demands, to adapt themselves to one another so as to harmonize with one another in a certain way. Or if we imagine there are no causes outside the blood to communicate new motions to the blood, that outside the blood there is no space, no other bodies to which the particles of blood could transfer their motion, it is certain the blood would remain always in this state, and its particles would suffer no changes other than those which can be conceived from a given relation of the motion of the blood to the lymph and chyle. Blood would have to be considered always a whole, not a part. But since there are very many other causes which in a certain way control the laws of nature, and in turn are controlled by blood, hence it comes about that other motions and other changes take place within the blood, which result not only from the mere relation of the motion of its parts to one another, but also from the relation of the motion of the blood, and also of the external causes to one another. In this way, the blood has the character of a part and not the whole. I have only spoken of whole and part. It's a really, really good passage. Happily read it another time. I'm not going to force it here as I go through the thing. But it's, it really helps get through sort of what he's talking about here when he's going through what he's talking about when he says the body's parts, the whole, how we distinguish, how they work, how they're influenced by other things, what a whole and a part mean. Fairly. Always liked it. Please, Derek. Apologies.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think you can see within that the kind of the relation of motion and rest plays an important part in that. I mean, so I think that gives us a clear understanding. So if we go to, so what Deleuze says, the notion of chyle and lymph, the blood in turn is part of the blood is part of an animal or human body. So it's, as you're saying, it's a whole, but it's also part of something. And that animal or human body is determined by another characteristic of dominant relation. And equally, there are no bodies whose relations are identical. For example, individuals with exactly the same blood. And what happens then in the case of poisoning or in the case of allergy? He says, in these cases, it appears that one of the constituted relations of the body is destroyed, decomposed, and death occurs, and the body's characteristic dominant relation is determined to be destroyed. So this is the kind of idea of decomposition, how this occurs. He said that, and the quote is, "I understand the body to die when its parts are so disposed that they acquire a different relation of motion and rest." And like I say, it's not a relation that changes. The relation itself doesn't change. It just becomes there is a different it acquires a different relation of motion and rest, and this will lead in an extreme case will lead to death. So Spinoza just makes clear what he meant by relation being destroyed or decomposed. This occurs when the relation, which is itself an eternal truth, is no longer realized by actual parts. So the parts the phrase is they realize the truth of the relation, but they're no longer able to do that. They don't do that. So chyle and lymph, go back to that example, realize the eternal truth of blood, but when they're no longer able to do that, the body, the blood, let's say the blood is decomposed. What has been done away with is not the relation, which is eternally true, but rather the parts between which it was established and which have now assumed another relation. So the parts themselves are things that change, and that they have entered into another relation. And he gives the example of blood. For example, the poison has decomposed the blood. So that this is something that enters in. It's another body that enters, and its parts interact with the parts of the blood, and that they enter into a different relationship. He says, as determine the parts of the blood to come into different relations that characterize other bodies, and it's no longer blood. And he says Bleinberg understands this very well and saying in his last letter that the same conclusion must hold for the soul, being itself composed of a very large number of parts. It shouldn't go the same disintegration with its parts passing into other non-human souls. And I think I feel that's the point of that is the point of death. This is what happens again. There's not only the body is decomposed, but the soul as well.
And I think it's worth continuing. To just follow up with that very in Weinberg, his last letter, basically I don't know, he does this amazing thing that a lot of people tend to do in his position. This is why Deleuze comment that he's a theologian, Calvinist, not so much interested in philosophy, because ultimately he believes all those parts have souls, and that the soul of me will pass into he takes it to that place he has to, and he very much seems to love it, but he kind of uses it then as a thrust to argue for the eternal soul in God once. Yeah, as you do. So to continue, thus Spinoza gives a special meaning to the classical thesis holding that evil is nothing. In his view, in any case, there are always relations that agree with another. For example, the agreement between a poison and the new relations in which the parts of the blood enter. But relations that agree, according to the natural order, do not necessarily coincide with the preservation of a particular relation, which may be dissolved, that is, cease realized. In this sense, there is no evil in itself, but there is that which is bad for me. Quote, those things are good which bring about the preservation of the relation of motion and rest the human body's parts have to one another. On the other hand, those things are bad which bring it about that the parts of the human body have a different relation of motion and rest to one another. Every object whose relation agrees with mine, that word, will be called good. Every object whose relation decomposes mine, even though it agrees with other relations, will be called bad. Convenience, word in there, then I'm not.
Yeah, so here what he's now is kind of doing away with the idea of evil, I would say. So he says in that kind of moralistic view of evil as a kind of something handed down from on high. So he said, thus Spinoza gives a special meaning to classical thesis on that evil. Well, evil is nothing. In other words, it's not a body. It doesn't produce being, I should say. It has no being. It's a non-being. I think he says that somewhere. And then in his view, in any case, they're all.
Oh, you're cutting out.
In his view, in any case, there are always relations that agree with one another. For example, so there's always agreement between the relations. There's always a relation that agree with one another. So the poison, so the agreement between a poison and the new relations to which the parts of blood enter. So that is an agreement. There is a relation, an agreement of relation there. But relations that agree according to natural order don't necessarily coincide with the preservation of particular relation. So it is not necessary that they preserve this. They're preservative. In other words, they can lead to death. So that some don't, but some do. Some will decompose, some will compose. So which may be dissolved. That is but relations that agree according to the natural law do not necessarily coincide with the preservation of a particular relation, which may be dissolved. That is, cease to be realized. In this sense, there is no evil in itself, but there is that which is bad for me. So something, can enter into different relations, which is bad for me. That's what's bad for me. That when the relations which compose me, which are kind of part, which ensure my, let's say, health in this instance, if they enter into a different relation, then that's bad for me. And then he gives a quote, those things are good, which bring about the preservation of the relation of motion and rest. So again, this notion of motion and rest, this is what Deleuze has called a characteristic relation of the individual. That's ourselves. The character relation of the individual is motion and rest. He said those things are good, which bring about a preservation of the relation of motion and rest. The human parts up to one another. On the other hand, those things are bad, which bring about that the parts of the human body have a different relation of motion and rest to one another. So they have a different relation, which effectively leads to illness, intoxication, and ultimately to death. And he says, every object whose relation agrees with mine, convenientia, will be called good. And every object whose relation decomposes mine, even though it agrees with other relations, will be called bad. So in disconvenientia. So it's, these relations, they're not bad in, somehow evil in themselves. They have this relation to ourselves, in this case, of either being convenient for ourselves or inconvenient or disconvenient for us. And so the first one will compose ourselves, will compose us. Second one will decompose us.
The way that he's discussing it, one of the examples he uses, this is taken directly from the ethics, as well as discussion we were having inside of the correspondence, but ethics 439, where he's talking about this. He uses the example of a Spanish poet who became very ill and damaged his brain so much that he could not recognize writing, and it made him really, really, like, it fucked him up, his brain really. All the parts of him are still there, but the relations are changed enough as he's alive and dead. He says a certain Spanish poet. That's literally what you to research and figure out which Spanish poet he means. He's heard tell of a certain Spanish poet, I think is the phrasing he used. So yeah, anytime you're on the internet and you go, boy, it seems non-specific, it's like, yeah, that's always been how people. To continue, I think.
Yeah.
Excellent. And no doubt, when one goes into the details, the situation becomes more and more complicated. To begin with, we have many constituent relations, so that one and the same object can agree with us in one respect and disagree with us in another. Secondly, each of our relations itself enjoys a certain latitude, so much so that it varies considerably from childhood to old age and death. Furthermore, illness or other circumstances can alter these relations to such an extent that one wonders if it's the same individual who goes on living. Since there are dead persons who do not wait for the transformation of their body into a corpse, the Spanish poet. Lastly, the modification can be such. A modified part of ourselves behaves like a poison that disintegrates the other parts against them. Certain diseases and, in the extreme case, suicide. You read the footnote, because it's kind of a big one and it's important for this. Two excellent texts of the ethics examine these various situations. 420 and 39, I mentioned the Spanish poet. In them, Spinoza considers first the case of survival in name only, when certain biological functions are retained, while all other relations have. Secondly, the case of self-destruction, when certain relations have changed so much due to external influences, they bring about the destruction of the whole, thus suicide, where external causes so dispose the imagination, and so affect the body that it takes on another nature contrary to the former. Certain modern medical problems seem to correspond exactly to Spinoza's themes. For example, so-called autoimmune diseases, which we will consider later, or the polemic around the attempts to keep alive artificially bodies that are naturally dead. The courageous statements of Dr. Schwarzenberg recently seem to take their inspiration spontaneously from a genuine. Thus, Schwarzenberg says that death is not a biological problem, but rather a metaphysical or ethical problem. Quote, no reason compels me to maintain that the body does not die unless it is changed into a corpse, and indeed, experience seems to urge a different conclusion. Sometimes a man undergoes such changes that I should hardly have said he was a man. The fucking good line. I think all pretty crisp and clear at this point, because we're still in that defining phase that Deleuze is doing. Yep. will continue. The model of poisoning is valid for all these cases in complexity. It applies not only to the harm we suffer, but to the harm that we do. We are not only poisoned, we are also poisoners. We act as toxins, poisons. Leyenberg himself invokes 3 examples. The act of killing, I destroy the characteristic relation with the body. The act of stealing, I destroy the relation that joins a man and property. And similarly with the act of adultery, what is destroyed is the relation with the marriage partner, the characteristic relation of a couple, which, though it is an instituted contractual social relation, nevertheless constitutes an individuality of a certain type. Analyzing them. With this model in view, Leyenberg raises first series of objections. 1. How can one distinguish vice from virtue? A crime from just an act? 2. How can one refer evil to a pure non-being for which God is not responsible and of which he is not the cause? Indeed, if it were true that there are always relations that enter into composition, while others are decomposed, one would have to acknowledge, on the one hand, that everything amounts to the same. Quote, the whole world would be put in an eternal and lasting confusion, and we men would be made like the beasts. Quote, on the other hand, evil exists to the same degree as good, since there is no less positivity in the sexual act performed with another man's wife than there is his own wife. Everyone get what Leyenberg's saying here, how he's talking about these things? Because this is going to be the rest of this section. So it's important to start being aware of the question, because when we start giving the answer, if you don't get the question, that'll be a fucking problem, to say the least. Excellent. Concerning, restating them, fair enough. So Leyenberg's 2 things. Based on all we're discussing about bodies here, all we're discussing about bodies, decomposition, composing, whatever it may be. How can one distinguish vice from virtue, good from evil, good from bad? How can you distinguish a crime from a just act? Because we're talking about bodies, not acts. Difference. There's a difference. He wants to tell you. How do you do that? 2, how can you refer evil to a pure non-being when God is, as if God is not the cause? Which is, this is the whole point, is like, if you're doing that, bodies connecting and doing stuff, they're just bodies, so God would be responsible. It puts everything on the same sort of plate. It would make men like beasts, to Leyenberg. They're fair religious sort of objections to it. Makes sense. It's kind of his point. He ends it with, I think this is actually really almost one for one what he says, but it's a guy who has sex with another man's wife or with his own wife, there's no more evil in one than the other, even though one may break it down, but the actual act itself doesn't have less positivity because of the way that we're talking about things now. That evil exists to the same degree as good, so, These are his questions. The response. Concerning the possibility, the necessity of distinguishing, Spinoza upholds all the rights of a logic of action. But this logic, this is, by the way, we're going to have to go through all of it. This is going to be really, really dense. Spinoza upholds all the rights of a logic of action, but this logic is so particular that his responses appear extremely obscure. I'll be quoting here from them. For example, Nero's matricide, insofar as it comprehends something positive, was not knavery. For Orestes, too, performed the same external action with the same intention of killing his mother. Nevertheless, he is not blamed, or at least not as severely as Nero is. What then was Nero's knavery? This he showed by that act that he was ungrateful, without compassion, and disobedient. God was not the cause of this, but was the cause of Nero's act and intention. In this instance, a difficult text will be explained by the ethics. what is positive or good in the act of beating Spinoza? What is good that this act, raising my arm, closing my fist, moving rapidly and forcibly, expresses a power of my body? It expresses what my body can do in a certain relation. What is bad in this act? The bad appears when the act is associated with the image of a thing whose relation is decomposed by that very act. I kill someone by beating him. The same act would have been good if it had been associated with the image of a thing whose relation agreed with it, as hammering iron. Which means that an act is bad whenever it directly decomposes a relation, whereas it is good whenever it directly compounds its relation with other relations. It might be objected that in any case there is both composition and decomposition. A decomposition of some relations and a composition of others, but what matters is knowing whether the act is associated with the thing insofar as that thing can compound it, or, on the contrary, so far as it is decomposed by it. Let us return to the two matricides. Orestes kills Clytemnestra, but he has killed Agamemnon, Orestes' father. So Orestes' act is precisely and directly associated with the image of Agamemnon, with Agamemnon's characteristic relation, an eternal truth with which the act agrees. But when Nero kills Agrippina, his act is associated only with the image of his mother, which directly decomposes. It is in this sense he shows he is, quote, ungrateful without compassion and disobedient. Similarly, when I strike a blow with anger or hatred, I join my action to an image of something that does not agree with the action, but on the contrary is decomposed by it. In short, there is certainly a distinction between vice and virtue, between good and bad action, but this distinction does not bear on the act itself or its image. Quote, no action considered in itself alone is good, bad, nor does it bear on the intention. It only concerns the determination, that is, the image of the thing with which the image associated, or more exactly, the relating of relation, the image of the act in its own relation, image of the thing in it. Is the act associated with an image of something whose relation it decomposes, or to something to which it joins its own relation? Holy shit, this is going to be a lot to go over. I don't really want to go into either of the major myths. We probably have to mention lightly stories and kind of go into them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the basic idea is that both Nero and Orestes kill their mothers, but whereas Nero is condemned for this, Orestes is less condemned, and he gives this idea of why that's so. I think that's it. I mean, like you said, I don't think you need to go fantastic detail. I think just one of the thoughts is just referring to the previous two short paragraphs. So we talked about acts of stealing, the act of killing, the act of adultery. I mean, acts are things that we can do. So the basic idea is that, Spinoza's one of his basic ideas is that we have capacity for action, and this is in a way good, but these seem to be acts that are bad. So I think that seems to be the arena in which this is being laid out. So I think
just real
the
quick,
question is how can we distinguish?
Because I think it's worth lightly going over, because he doesn't say specifically what's going on with Agamemnon or any of this. Like he implies it, but if you don't know, he doesn't actually directly say, like, so Agamemnon kills. Agamemnon's a piece of shit. He's a just fucking asshole. Kills a whole bunch of people, and Orestes basically is killing his mother, but not because she's his mother, not for any sort of other thing, but specifically because of this vengeance, sort of God-ordained vengeance. This is why when he says that the relation is about Agamemnon as a thing, but Nero killed his mom to get power. Like literally, it was like almost directly. He just hated his mom, and like he tried to kill her a bunch of times. What a piece of shit. And this, I think ultimately he didn't even kill her. He sent soldiers. And it basically he did it in order to gain more political power. Like it's worth the difference is stark, and I think it's worth mentioning. I have to use the restroom. I'll be back. Sorry, Derek. Please. Apologies.
Yeah, I think the key is that they both seem to be equal acts, but how do you distinguish between them? So that's why it says concerning the possibility and necessity of distinguishing. So this is a point of this paragraph, I think. And he says Spinoza upholds all the rights of a logic of action, but his logic is so particular that his responses appear extremely obscure. So this, like I was saying, I think the acts are, it's what the body can do. I mean, if we remember earlier in the book, Spinoza wants to focus on what we're capable of, our capacity or our power. And it comes out in one way in terms of what the body can do through the acts. And here we have two acts which seem the same. They're both kind of examples of what Deleuze calls matricide, i.e. killing one's mother. And so the example, the quote is from, but he says that his responses to this question seem obscure. And so I think obviously what Deleuze is going to do is going to kind of see how how you can distinguish between these two acts of matricide or matricide. And so he gives, for example, Nero's matricide, insofar as it comprehends something positive, was not knavery. So it's an act which acts, and like I said, acts are positive. Therefore, in that sense, it's not an evil act, or it's not knavery, it's not a bad action. And then we've got Orestes, who basically kills his mother because who killed. The story is basically Orestes kills his mother. I forget the name of the mother. That'll come out in a bit. Anyway, he kills the mother because the mother killed his father. Agrippina. Oh no, that's Nero's mother. Anyway, I can't remember the name of that. But I think basically the reason why the mother wants to kill Orestes' father was because the father ordered the sacrifice of their daughter before they set off for Athens, if I remember correctly, or they set off somewhere. So there was a reason why that happened, but that's not part of this anyway. So go back to the point of this. So for Orestes to perform the same external action and with the same intention of killing his mother. So he said that they both performed the same action. Nevertheless, he's not blamed, or at least not as severely as Nero. So what then was Nero's knavery? Nothing but this. He showed that by the act that he was ungrateful. So by this act, so it's a positive act in that it's an act, but it's negative in that through that act he showed that he was ungrateful, without compassion, disobedient. And God wasn't the cause of this, but was the cause of Nero's act and intention. So the act and its intention was caused by God, but not I think what's been saying was the kind of ungrateful element within that, the kind of, let's call it the bad element, And he said, in this instance, a difficult text will be explained by the ethics. So the explanation for that example here is given by the ethics. So this is what Deleuze do. He connects this example that Spinoza gives in his letter to Bleinberg, and he kind of explains it through the ethics. So he says, acts are seen as positive. So what is positive or good in the act? And he gives the example of an act which might seem, on the face of it, to be a kind of a bad act. So the act of beating. So what is positive or good in the act of beating? And Spinoza asks, What is good is that this act, raising my arm, closing my fist, moving rapidly and forcefully, expresses the power of my body, expresses what my body can do in a certain relation. So this is, again, acts are always seen as positive in that they express exactly what Deleuze is saying. They express the power of my body, expresses what my body can do, its capacity, what it can do. The question then is, what is bad in this act? And he said the bad appears when the act is associated with the image of a thing whose relation is decomposed by the very act. So it's not the beating that's bad in it, it's what it's kind of related to, what's it associated with. It's associated with an image of a thing whose relation is decomposed by the very act. I killed someone by beating him. He gives an example. He said the same act of beating could be good. The same act would have been good if it had been associated with a thing whose relation agreed with it. And he gives the example of hammering iron, so that the iron is formed by hammering, and so that's
which is
a
the
form
same.
of beating.
It's the same motions, same thing, same actions of the
Yeah.
body.
But it's forming something, and it's kind of it composes the body of the iron. So it's whereas the other one, the killing decomposes that body, whereas the hammering composes the body of the iron. So and then he says it, which means that an act is bad whenever it directly decomposes a relation, whereas it's good when it directly compounds its relation with the other. So the joining of the act of beating and the iron composes. It's good when it directly compounds its relation with other relations. So this is the notion of bodies meeting, and they're composing or they're compounded. They join together.
So is Orestes' killing of his mother one that composes his relationship with his father?
Yeah, so I think we'll see that next. So he says it might be objected that in any case there is both composition and decomposition. So a composition of some relations and a composition of others. So that's the objection you could raise to those two ideas. But what matters is knowing whether the act is associated with the image of a thing insofar as the thing can compound with it, on the contrary, insofar as it is decomposed by it. And so, so it now returns to that example of the two matricide.
And the phrase is
Right. As
specifically,
opposed to Nero's killing of his mother is the one that decomposes, right, that relationship.
yeah, it's
Yeah, so he says, if we go through it, we see what he says. So he says, let us return to the two matricides. Orestes killed Clytemnestra, but she has killed Agamemnon, who is Orestes' father. So Orestes' act is precisely indirectly, so the act of killing anyway, let's just go act. So what is matricide, is active matricide is directly associated with the image of Agamemnon, with Agamemnon's characteristic relation as an eternal truth with which the act agrees. So the act, Orestes' act, agrees with Agamemnon's characteristic relation as an eternal truth. So this kind of act, so the characteristic, I would say, like I say, is quite complex, but I think the characteristic relation of a body, of an individual, is this notion of motion and rest. So Agamemnon's act is by definition an act of motion and rest. So it agrees with that. So it agrees with that image. So it has this agreement with that. So it's good in that sense. But when Nero kills Agrippina, his mother, his act associated only with the image of his mother, which it does. So it goes directly to the mother through which the act decomposes the individual who is Agrippina. So it's not in that sense. It's bad. In the sense that he shows that, he shows that he is ungrateful, quote, ungrateful without compassion, disobedient. And then those are examples from myth. But then he says, similarly, when I strike a blow with, quote, anger or hatred, I join my action. So the blow can be, like I say, it can be something good if it composes something, if it's joined to something which it composes. In short, he says, join my action to an image that does not agree. So when I strike a blow with anger or hatred, I join my action to an image of something that does not agree with the action, but on the contrary, is decomposed by it.
Well, it's the
In
way
short,
he
it's-
phrases at the very end, I think, is the best. Is the act associated with an image of something whose relation it decomposes, or to something to which it joins its own relation? And that's the it's such a really crisp line, I think, that he finally gets.
Yeah, and he said the point is to make a distinction. So the point of this paragraph, he says, is to kind of distinguish between, good and bad, or and he says to be short, there's certainly a distinction between vice and virtue, between a good and a bad action. But it's not the act itself. The act itself is not bad, as we've seen. The act of beating can be both good and bad. It depends on what the image of the thing towards which it's directed and whether it composes or decomposes it. No action, quote, no action considered in itself alone is good or bad, nor does it bear an intention. So it's not like what is your intention behind this action. It only concerns the determination, that is the image of the thing with which the image of the act is associated, more exactly, the relating of two relations, the image of the act in its own relations with the image of the thing in its relation. And the point is the act associated with an image of something whose relation it decomposes, or something to which it joins its own relation, so it composed or decomposed by the act.
Yes, it's the phrase. If we don't want to talk about it, it's the act composing or decomposing. Because if the act is acting upon a body, like the body's already composed. Like there's a body here. Now I'm doing something. The question is ultimately like about the image of something whose relation it decomposes. The killing of the mother, like directly. That's or to something which joins its own relation. The killing as revenge, avenging your father. There's a joining of a new relation. There's a composition.
Yeah, I think with Orestes and Agamemnon, I'm not sure if he would say it's a revenge, because he says it's not the intention, it's not the point. The point is whether it agrees with the relation. One relation agrees with another. So my take on that is that his action, in a sense, agrees with the. He says Agamemnon's characteristic relation as an eternal truth with which that act agrees.
It composes
like
with that image, the eternal image.
Yeah, exactly. It's not an act of revenge. I mean, it is in intention, but that's not the point. The point is one act agrees with the other. The other act, the act of Agamemnon, who's not there, is dead, obviously, but Agamemnon's characteristic relation, the characteristic relation of Agamemnon is like, as all individual, is this relation of movement and rest. So Orestes' act is an act of movement and rest. So that they agree in that sense, which makes them good.
Yeah. All right. Next paragraph. If this is indeed the point of distinction, one understands in what sense evil is nothing. For, from the standpoint of nature or God, there are always relations that compound, and nothing but relations compound in accordance with eternal law. Whenever an idea is adequate, it precisely captures at least two bodies, mine and another, insofar as they compound their relations, common notion. On the other hand, there is no adequate idea of bodies no adequate idea of a body that disagrees with mine insofar as it disagrees. Since evil, or rather bad, only exists in terms of inadequate ideas and the affections of sadness that follow from them, hatred, etc. I'm actually going to...
Yeah, and I think this paragraph brings us to the. I think it's the second of the. Let me see. What Deleuze calls the threefold practical problems with ethics that was listed at the end of the previous paragraph. How does one manage to form adequate ideas? So this is the notion of adequate and inadequate ideas. I think, yeah, adequate ideas, inadequate and adequate ideas. So if this is a point of distinction, one understands in what sense evil is nothing. For from the standpoint of nature or God, there are always relations. So there are always these relations that compound, and nothing but relations that compound in accordance with eternal laws. So whenever an idea is adequate, it precisely captures at least two bodies, mind and another. So we've got that notion of the idea of Agamemnon, to which the act, Orestes' act, is related. So this is the idea of Agamemnon is an adequate idea, mind and other, insofar as they compound their relations. And he gives this other phrase here, common notion. On the other hand, there's no adequate idea of bodies that disagree, no adequate. So again, I think this is the example of Nero and his mother. On the other hand, there's no adequate idea of bodies that disagree, no adequate idea of a body that disagrees with mind, insofar as it disagrees. In this sense, evil, or rather bad, only exists in terms of inadequate ideas and in the affections of sadness that follow from them, hatred, anger, etc. So there are these adequate ideas, and from that, there are the affections, in this case, the affections of sadness. So through and again, this is really starting to get into the real detail of how the theory of affections actually works. So it's through the notion of inadequate and adequate ideas that we either form a clear idea in which bodies relate, and there is this mutual composition, shall we say, rather. But when there's no adequate idea of bodies that disagree, then there is. Then this leads to inadequate ideas, and which in turn, what follows from those inadequate ideas is an affection, a feeling of sadness that follows from them. And so this sadness obviously kind of has quite a very broad range, as we saw last week: hatred, anger, etc.
Yes. The specific moment from ethics to just quote is that knowledge of evil is inadequate knowledge. The knowledge of evil is pain insofar as we are thereof. Now, pain is the transition to a lesser perfection, therefore cannot be understood through man's nature. Therefore, it is a passive state which depends on inadequate ideas. Consequently, the knowledge thereof, namely the knowledge of evil, is adequate. It follows that if the human mind possessed only adequate ideas, form no conception. Great line. If you haven't noticed, I've copied the text. The way that it's written, incredibly referential to other parts of the document. What makes ethics really kind of a bear to read, because he's referring across to sort of everything else side of it. Even actually, when Claire posted Ethics 3, Propositions 1 through 10, he references that literally inside of Proposition 4, inside of Ethics 4. It's written like an academic geometric textbook of proofs. Fascinating.
Yeah. So we have a proposition, then the proof,
Yep.
and then the corollary, which is the kind of further kind of propositional statement that comes out of the proof.
Excellent.
And the other thing to notice is, so we've got this notion of actions, what the body can do. This is really the important, the total center of Spinoza's thinking. And one of the things he says in that proof, he says, he says, pain is the transition to a lesser perfection, therefore cannot be understood through man's nature. Therefore, it is a passive state. Therefore, which essentially means it is a state that lacks action. It's passive. It doesn't have any capacity for action. So it's the thing that robs us of the power of action. So yeah, and this is how it, and then which leads to these sad passions.
Here we go.
It sounds like the difference between the two matricides are differentiated subtly if you think of them both as as good or bad, but not necessarily based on the idea of evil. But because Nero's killing of his mother is an inadequate idea based on inadequate, whereas Orestes' killing of his mother is based on an adequate idea. Would that be right?
Yeah. So yeah, one is positive action because it joins Aristides' act is joined to the image of his father in terms of his what he called his characteristic relation as an eternal truth. So that these things agree, so they compound with one another. So that's an agreement which is good. Whereas the other one, it just has no clear idea. Oh, it's an image of his mother, which it directly, well, it literally directly decomposes. So yeah, so that and then that is an inadequate idea.
It's just to quote, it's the one place that Spinoza mentions these myths is literally. So I just want to read it because it does fill out the color of it. First, then, I say that God is absolutely and effectively the cause of everything that has essence, be it A. Now, if you evil, error of villainy, etc., is something which expresses essence, I will fully admit to you that God is the cause of villainy, evil, error, etc. I think I have sufficiently shown that that which gives its form to evil, error, or crimes does not consist in anything which expresses essence, and that therefore it cannot be said that God is the cause thereof. For example, Nero's matricide, insofar as it contained something positive, not a crime. For Orestes, too, did the same outward deed, had the same intention of killing his mother, and yet he is not blamed, at least not in the same degree as Nero. What then was Nero's crime? Nothing else than that by this deed he showed that he was ungrateful, unmerciful, obedient. It is certain that none of these things express an essence, and therefore God was not the cause of them, though he was the cause of the act and intention of quotes there. It's a really specific, like literally, there's nowhere else, by the way. So there's no, that's it. That's as deep as that goes. Hoping there was more, I cannot. Anyone can.
Yeah, it's interesting that quote because I think one of the things it does make clear actually is that this notion of where are we? So Nero is described as ungrateful, without compassion, disobedient by Deleuze, and then he says God was not the cause of this. So it's not. I think one of the things we could say is that lack of compassion, disobedience, the character of being ungrateful, are not a part. I'm trying to think of what I'm saying. Are not part of our being, So they're not there. They're not put there by God. They're kind of consequence of certain actions. So I think that's an interesting insight into that thinking because, I mean, what anyway, we'll come to it. I think we'll come to it anyway. But he talks about, he says the individuals are what he calls singular essences, and that's the other thing that is outside of that the singular essence.
Mm-hmm.
Those kind of those what would you call them? Properties or something? Yeah, whatever they are.
Let's dive forward because it's an important part. This is finally. But here again, everything will be called back into question. Let us suppose, then, that evil is nothing from the standpoint of relations that compound according to senses that are expressed in these. Spinoza acknowledges that, well, the acts are equally perfect. The actors are not. The essences are not equally perfect. these singular essences, the way as the individual posed. Hence, are there not singular essences that are irreducibly associated with badness, which would suffice to reintroduce the position of an absolute evil? Are there not singular essences to which it pertains to poison? Thus, Lindbergh raises a second series of objections. Does it not pertain to certain essences to commit crimes, to kill others, or even to kill themselves? Are there not essences that find in crime not a poison but a delicious food? The objection is carried over from the evil of malice to the evil of misfortune. For whenever a misfortune befalls me, that is, whenever one of my relations is, this event pertains to my essence, even if other relations nature. It can therefore pertain to my essence to become a criminal. Does not Spinoza himself speak of the affections of essence? Hence, even if one grants that Spinoza has managed to evil from the order of individual relations, it is not certain that he managed to expel it from the order of singular essences, that is, singularities deeper than those relations.
Yeah. So
I mean, let's make this fast because this is a pretty crisp one. Go for it, Derek.
okay. So we've talked about the relation of evil to the relation. So the relation between bodies, the relations which either compose or decompose, that compound according to the laws of nature. So poison will decompose our relations that we have in terms of in bodily relations. It says, can the same be said concerning the essences that are expressed in those relations? The essence, this is, I was saying earlier, this is what we are. We are the essences. He calls us at the beginning, somewhere near the beginning, he talks about this individual as a singular essence. So he says, Spinoza acknowledges that while the acts or deeds may be equally perfect, the actors are not, the essences are not equally perfect. So again, these are the individuals. And these singular essences themselves are not constituted in the same way as individual relations are composed. So they're not composed. They're not constituted in the same way the individual relations are composed. I.e., they kind of agree with one another, shall we say? Hence, are there not singular essences that are reducible? So there's a question. So a question is asked here. A number of questions are being asked. So are there not singular essences that are reducibly associated with badness, which would suffice to reintroduce the position of an absolute evil? So he said, are there not individuals who are just bad, which would then introduce a position of an absolute evil? So what's in the previous paragraphs, what's being gone through is that things aren't evil in themselves. That's something that is something extra. You know, he said, I mean, the idea is that it's not the relations can be good and can be composed and decomposed, but the characteristic of the individual. Well, it comes back to this notion of adequate and inadequate ideas, that just to make it short. But anyway, the point is, he said, are there not singular essences, so individuals that are reduced associated with badness, which would suffice to introduce the position of an absolute evil? So previous paragraphs, it seems to be getting rid of this notion of evil, replacing it with good and bad. And he said, are there not, so the question there is, are there not singular essences to which it pertains to poison? So this notion of pertain, it pertains to poison. So these singular essences, are they not like, perhaps not like poison? I'm trying to think of a good way of saying that. Thus, Blyenberg raises a second series of objections. Does it not pertain to certain essences to commit crime? So that, are they not, intrinsic to certain essences that they commit crime, to kill others, even to kill themselves? Are there not essences that find in crime not a poison but a delicious food? And the objection is carried over from the evil of malice to the evil of misfortune. For whenever misfortune befalls me, that is, whenever one of my relations decomposes, this event pertains to, that's me, that's my essence. Even for other relations, even if other relations compound in nature, it can therefore pertain to my essence to become. So I think this is the point that it can, in this analysis, it seems it can pertain to my essence to become a criminal. And then he says, does not speak of the affections of essence. So the affections, the affects that we're capable of. So he says, hence, These are this is the kind of detailed objection that Spinoza will answer. And even if one grants that Spinoza has managed to expel evil from the order of individual relations, so in the previous paragraph, so what he did, he expels evil from that order. It's just kind of good and bad composition or decomposition. It is not certain that he managed to expel it from the order of singular essences. So individuals themselves can be evil, that is, of singularities deeper than those. So the singularities themselves deeper underlie these relations. So that's a question. Are individuals, are they evil in themselves?
This is also this next bit we're reading we'll just say turns a corner in how he's dealing with Blaenberg. It's important because I'm going to read the next paragraph, but I want to read the beginning of the letter in response, just a few lines from it. Because the guy Blaenberg wrote a couple letters in a row that I would say are pretty shitty. Again, it's hard to tell because of the old prose that's used, but he's basically like, well, you're treating me as if like I have no interest in reason. Why would you do such a thing? Just want to read. I like this does not contradict my first letter, for then I regarded you as a philosopher pure and simple, who, as many who consider themselves Christians admit, has no other touchstone for truth other than natural understanding and not theology. But you have taught me differently, and shown me the foundation on which I had meant to build our friendship was not laid as I thought. Very, very funny. Like the way it sort of shits on him. The rest of this is, as Deleuze will say, it's terse. The very, very hardcore response from Spinoza here, he's very specific, like the rest of this. So that, again, we're talking about the idea of what if someone had the position of evil? What if their nature with this essence? Again, this question of. So to read the next paragraph. Spinoza's reply is terse. If crime pertained to my essence, it would be pure and simple virtue. But the whole question is precisely this. What is meant by pertain to essence? What pertains to an essence is always a state, that is, a reality, a perfection that expresses a power or capacity for being affected. Now, a person is not malicious or unfortunate according to the affection he has, but according to the affection he does not have. The blind man cannot be affected by light, nor the malicious man by an intellectual. If he is said to be malicious or unfortunate, not because of the state he has, but because of a state he does not have, or no longer has. Now, an essence cannot have any other state than its own, just as it cannot have any other essence. Quote, for then vision no more pertains to that man, without contradiction, than it does to the stone. Similarly, when we attend to the nature of a man who is led by an appetite for pleasure, we compare his present appetite with that which he had at a time. That our appetite no more pertains to that man's nature than it does the nature of the devil or of the stone. Therefore, evil no more exists in the order of essence than it does in the order of relations, for just as it never consists in a relation, but only in a relation between relations, evil is never in a state or in an essence, but in a comparison of states, no more validity than a comparison of essences. I do want to read a couple of the footnotes that are here, where Spinoza directly addresses the idea of the man as the nature of a criminal or nature of enjoyment of being on the gallows. First, if the question is whether the two acts of the just man and the thief, insofar as they are something real and caused by God, are not equally perfect, then I say that if we consider the acts alone, and in such a way, it may well be that both are equally perfect. If you then ask whether the thief and the just man are not equally perfect and blessed, answer. Phrasing. The other I really like, because this is where like he ends. Because he just is kind of getting very frustrated. You can read it. If anyone sees that he can live better on the gallows, actually, I'm just going to Lastly, as regards to your question, supposes a contradiction just as if somebody asked me if it accorded better with the nature of someone that he should hang himself, would there be any reason why he should not hang himself? However, suppose it is possible there is such a nature, then I say, whether I admit the freedom of the will or not, that if someone sees that he can live better on the gallows than at his own table, he would act most foolishly if he did not go and hang himself. And he who clearly saw that he would in fact enjoy a more perfect or better life or essence, pursuing crimes rather than following virtue, would be a fool if he did not pursue them. For in relation to such a perverted human nature, crimes would be virtuous. Fantastic response. Very, very blunt. I like it. Spinoza is very passive aggressive.
Yeah, so the question is that is evil, does evil, I think the word he keeps using, does it pertain to the essence of, well, the singular essence that we are? And he says, so the paragraph that we're on now says, Spinoza's prize terse, if crime pertained to my essence, it would be a pure and simple virtue. Therefore, if it did, everything that pertains to my essence is a virtue. Therefore, crime would be a virtue. He said, but the old question is precisely this: what he meant by pertains to essence. And he says, what pertains to an essence is a state, that is, a reality, a perfection that expresses a power or capacity for being affected. So he brings it back to this notion of the effects, of the affection, our capacity that we have, our power of being affected. And previously, obviously, the kind of notion of the act, the ability to act as well, that was previously. He says, now a person is not malicious or unfortunate according to the affections he has, but according to the affections he does not have. So the blind man cannot be affected by light, nor a malicious man by an intellectual light. If he's said to be malicious or unfortunate, this is not because of the state he has. So it's not part of his essence, shall we say, not because of the state he has, but because of the state he does not have or no longer has. So again, this state, this kind of, again, it's this notion of power, capacity, all those ideas that's being talked about. He said, now an essence cannot have any other state than its own, just as it cannot have any other essence. Quote, for then vision no more pertains to that man without contradiction than it does to the stone. Similarly, when we attend to the nature of a man is led by an appetite for sensual pleasure, we compare this present appetite with that which he had at another time. The better appetite no more pertains to that man's better nature, it does to the nature of the devil or of a stone. So again, these things, I mean, I think this...
He's saying that evil is naturally a comparative element. It doesn't exist as sort of its own thing. It's always comparative. He gives examples of the great appetites, or as he's doing this, he's kind of going through sins. He's discussing sort of sins and things like that. They're comparative. They're not sort of the thing in and of itself. To go back to the actions, a man's arm movement that does and pounding, and it can be like defense of oneself. It can be hammering a nail into a wall. It can be beating your wife. That's not the point. The point of evil, as we discuss it, is naturally comparative. It's putting things in that place. Evil is only in relation between relations, never in a state itself. Comparison of states. So it can't ever be a singular essence.
I think the notion of the act, though, that's an act, where this is a state. I think they're different. So it's something, and the state, I mean, just trying to make sense. What pertains to an essence is always a state. So that is a reality perfection that expresses the power. So this expresses the power, capacity for being affected. Now, a person is not malicious or unfortunate according to the affection he has, but according to the affections he does not have. So something that they lack.
Which means it's comparative to someone who has it. So if everyone was blind, we wouldn't call people blind people. Right?
No, I
It's
think, well, he says that the blind man cannot be affected by light. So,
right, but that's
I'm just,
because the man who has sight can be. That's the point as he's going through this, that um, the the comparative nature at its base. A man who can't see, we say that because he can't, he's unable to do a thing that is like sort of normative. I mean, I would say it's about normativity versus otherness. That the blind man can't be affected by light, nor the malicious man intellectual light. This is not because of the state he has, but because of a state he does not have. It's naturally comparative. You can't just lack a thing, like in the state itself, because then that's not the thing. The relations is necessary. The way he kind of goes, it loses maybe skipping a step, but if we go back and we think about the whole and its parts, and we think about the relations of things, if a piece is missing, then like the whole it's a different set of relations. It's that's the thing that he's kind of going about here. And when we talk about evil
yeah, I
essence,
think
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the point is though that um, the the what the blind person lacks um, has no bearing on the essence of that person. As he said at the end, like, so evil is never in a state or in an essence. So it's never in that state of the power or capacity for being affected. So evil's not in that. It's not in an essence the individual that we are, but in a comparison of states that has no more validity than a comparison of essences. So the notion of comparison has no bearing on on uh, on the um, on the essence, on the singular essence of the the individual as they are, on their power. It's not a comparative thing. So the fact that a blind man cannot be affected by light uh, is it has no bearing on the essence of that individual. So the blind man cannot be affected by light, nor the malicious man by it. If he is said to be malicious or unfortunate, this is not because of the state he has, but because of the state he does not have. So that if we say, "Oh, the blind man cannot be affected by light," so he is lacking in something, but that's not the essence of that person. We're saying we're comparing a blind person to someone who can see, and he said that's not the point. He said it's not a comparative. He says he was never in a state or in an essence, but it's the evil. So he's getting rid of evil. So he says evil is not in that state or in the essence of the not in the state of the individual in terms of their power to be affected. They're not in their essence as a singular essence. So the evil is in if we compare the states, and he said that has no more validity than so comparison doesn't work in either instance. If we compare the states that what they're capable of with one to another, or we compare the essence of one to another, he said that's where the evil is, but it's has no validity.
Trying to find specifically the line so I makes it fun when this. See if I can find it and post it below. I don't have a PDF. I've been looking at version of this. It's been original translation, one that's very much honored, and then they've kind of had a few people not as. All right. With that, I am going to say this is where we're going to hold out um, of this, and we're going to continue next week, 2-hour mark. And I do. Thanks to everyone's time. Thank you all for joining. Next week, we will pick up right from here, make our note through how Leonberg protests the most through this. And this is where they really have their moment of separation, to say the least. Because Blumenberg very much believes the essence of evil. Spinoza very, very, very be an interesting one, and I look forward to all of it.